All right, so good evening, Rabbi. We are continuing tonight. Actually, tonight we're going to finish the Malacha of M'amer. So if you remember, again, we began M'amer last week, speaking about, again, what's really fascinating about, I think, about some of this, absolutely. I think what's great about, you're really getting into this. Yeah. Wow, this is okay. This is, I feel like my COVID PTSD kicking in over here. I don't sit that close to my wife, but, it's not like, I'm kidding. Of course, it'll be a schos. So we began last week with the interesting discussion about the Malacha of M'amer. And I think, as I mentioned last week in the Shir, part of the beauty of going through Lamates Malachas from beginning to end is the opportunity to see some of the Malachas that are a little less studied, right, and a little bit lesser known. So M'amer, the Malacha, ultimately, again, of gathering things into a pile. And what we've discussed is the concept that the Malacha of M'amer really only applies, number one, to Gedulei Karka, things that grow from the ground, and specifically only applies to things, or only applies to gathering done in the mamish, in the place where the item grows. So, for example, if one were to harvest wheat and then go ahead and gather the wheat into piles, so then halacha l'maisa, that would be the malacha of M'amer. If one were to harvest wheat, bring the wheat ultimately into the silo, and then gather it in the silo, that is not the malacha of M'amer, because that is not where the wheat grew. So a couple of more exceptions to the malacha of M'amer, and then actually we're going to do a really interesting sugya tonight that's a little bit of a tangent. So let's begin with an Aruch HaShulchan and Ramon. Aruch HaShulchan says, you can skip really to the underlined lines, where he writes over here as follows. He says, Upashit, again, not that the first part is not important, it's all important, but it's interesting to see, we're going to focus on one specific point. He says, Upashitu, to lo shayach M'amer ela bitvua uperos shelo ne'afu v'lo nisbashlu v'gam lo nitchalu sha'adayim hem kiniktarim ukinitloshim. So the Aruch HaShulchan brings us something which I think was intuitively obvious, but it's important that he says it, that the Malacha of M'amer only applies to items, food items, or items in their original form. So for example, if you were to cook an item, grind an item, somehow change the form of the item, halacha l'maisa, the malacha of M'amer does not apply. And he says something very interesting. He says, the imlokein, if this was not the case, aser b'Shabbos la'aniach kama lachamim l'makom echad or la'aniach kama minei peros ze eitzel zeh. So I'll say, if this was not the case, then one could make the argument that going ahead and, let's say, taking a bunch of rolls and putting them together, or a bunch of pieces of fruit, and arrange them on a platter, right, would be malacha of M'amer. So again, it's intuitive, because the truth is, once you go ahead and you understand the malacha M'amer only applies to something where it grew, so then l'maisa, b'pashtos, it makes sense that it's only going to apply in its original form as well. But nevertheless, the Aruch HaShulchan feels compelled to explain this. Good. He says, Ella vaday da isra ein ella behi lakta min hasodeh, umin aginos, umin ailonos, v'lo kishem babayis. And I will say again, here he restates the fact that the malacha of M'amer only applies ultimately again in the field or in the gardens, but ultimately again not in the house. V'kol shekain li'achar tchina va'afia ubishon. I will say now, what I will tell you something very interesting that I think could be an interesting application of this. Remember, again, we had the concept of whether or not is there M'amer achar M'amer, right? Imor achar imor. If something was piled, and then let's say, again, the pile becomes dispersed, is there a biblical prohibition to go ahead, or at least even a rabbinic prohibition, to repile it again? So I'll tell you, this could come up in a situation, again, I think it's far-fetched, but it's an interesting application of it. In other words, let's say it's something that was piled, let's say you do hold that yesh imor achar imor, and in the interim, ultimately, the object changed form, or some object underwent some other kind of change. Would there be a subsequent malacha of M'amer or not? Okay, so like I said, quite a far-fetched case, but interesting nevertheless. So again, but continuing the exceptions, M'amer only applies if the object that was harvested is in its original state. I will say another interesting exception. Take a look at number 2. This is actually quite interesting. He says, Mashakasav Hagon Reb Shimon Eider, B'Shem Sefer Badi HaShulchan. Listen to this. Da ose kibutz haprochim hashonim lefi derech hayofi hu chayiv mitzad meleches M'amer. So listen to this. He quotes Rav Badner, quotes the Badi HaShulchan, and says like this. What about gathering flowers to make it into a bouquet? And I was saying, obviously we're talking about detached flowers, right? Because otherwise we have an issue of kotzer. So let's say on Shabbos, I want to gather up just already cut flowers to make it into a bouquet. So the quotes over here from the Badi HaShulchan that would be aser, because it would be M'amer. It would be M'amer. Now, Rav Moshe Paskins, I will say, this is actually very interesting. He says, good. He says, Lefi derech hayofi. I'm sorry. The Ose Kibbutz Abrachim the Hashonim Lefi derech hayofi who chayim inside Melachos M'amer. So Moshe says, Lo borur zeh lanias daiti. I don't think that's correct. He says, the Melachos Kibbutz harbe shibalim la'arima aval Kibbutz haprachim eino inyan Kibbutz arima meprachim elahu Kibbutz prachim shonim sheyatimu zeh lazeh eino klal inyan malacha zu v'tzarech iyon. So Moshe says like this. Both said what is the purpose of the malacha of M'amer? Right? Why do you gather produce into a pile in the field? Why is that done? So first of all, it's more efficient, and it also protects the produce, right? So there's an efficiency perspective, and ultimately, again, a produce protection perspective. Rav Moshe says, when you gather flowers into a bouquet, what's your purpose? What's your beauty? So Rav Moshe says, that's not M'amer. M'amer is a utilitarian malacha that is done in order to allow logistically for easier transport of the collective pile and to protect the pile, to protect all the produce in the pile. But any type of gathering of something for beauty purposes, again, I don't know what's going to be another good example of this besides flowers, but let's say gathering flowers into a bouquet will not be the malacha of M'amer. Okay, interesting.
Does this apply to Yom Tov as well, since it's not a chumrah?
Does this? Yes. So, all right. When we finish Lamates Malachas in just a couple of weeks, Emir Hashem, we're going to get. Don't laugh so hard, okay? We're gonna get into the halachas of Yom Tov. So the short answer to your question is yes. By Malacha of Yom Tov, the Malachas of Yom Tov, Ochel Nefesh only allows for non-large scale malachas. Any malacha that is normally a malacha done on larger scale, you can't do on Yom Tov even for Ochel Nefesh purposes. So M'amer, Kotzer, these are the types of malachas done on large scale, and therefore, again, at least according to most poskim, you're not allowed to do it.
So then Sukkot, putting your load together, Sukkot morning, gathering all the things together.
No, because it's not b'makom gidulan. Right? That's your carve out. That's your carve out. In other words, it's not maybe going to the field, and gathering, but again, b'pashtos, it's on your dining room table, not a problem. Not a problem. So I will say, take a look at number 3. Another interesting idea over here. Now we're going to get into the Dinei Drabanan. So watch this. Asur lekabetz melach mimisrafos hamelach. So we'll say, you can't gather salt. You can't gather salt on Shabbos. Now we'll say, just so you should understand, the salt that he's talking about over here is a salt pool. Right? You take salt water, you put it in a pool, the water evaporates, and then you gather the salt from the ground. So you can't go ahead and gather salt on Shabbos. This case is interesting as opposed to mining salt, but let's assume right now it's all the same basic idea. You can't gather salt on Shabbos. Why? Shedome le'ma'amer. Because it looks like M'amer. Now both say, let's a little chazara. Why isn't it M'amer? So remember again, right, correct. M'amer only applies to giduli karka. It only applies to items that grow from the ground. It doesn't, even though, again, I will say, that's why I mentioned, there's a whole discussion in the poskim about, what about mined salt? Right? Mined salt. Right? So is mined salt subject? So b'pashtos, the poskim really agree that giduli karka really means like vegetation. It doesn't mean things that, let's say, occur in the earth. So therefore, again, the act of gathering salt together on Shabbos, says the Shulchan Aruch, is going to be asr because it is domet le'ma'amer. It's like ma'amer. V'chein asr lekabes kol davar mimakom gidulo. And again, in this rabbinic prohibition, would be gathering anything in the place where it grew, even if technically speaking it doesn't fall under the category of giduli karka. Yes. No, so remember, it's on the ground. It's only on the ground because remember, it only resembles M'amer if it's on the ground, right? Or as we saw, let's say, with the case of the figs last week, in the place where items are normally piled. But the act of gathering your salt together on your table is not going to be. That's not this prohibition. So we'll say, stick a look at Mishnah Berurah. This is actually really interesting, and it's going to open the door to a topic that has always confounded me. So listen to this. Number 4, Shedome, the Melachos M'amer. hu la'asof shibolin v'gam hu ke'ein zeh. Remember, what's the Melacha M'amer? The Melacha of M'amer is ultimately gathering stalks together. That's the Melacha M'amer. By the way, not just stalks, things that grow from the ground. V'dafka b'makom misrafo shesham hu makom gidulo shel hamelach. And it's dafka in the pool, because, so to speak, that's where the salt grew. Not literal, right? But since in the pool, that's where the salt came to creation, ultimately again. So gathering it there is like M'amer. Listen to this. Shesham hu makom gidulo shel hamelach. Dumya dishibalin basada. So therefore, rabbinically, it's comparable to stalks that are spread out in the field. And Steve, here's your question. But Mishnah Berurah says, if let's say you have salt, and the salt scattered somewhere else, there's no problem gathering the salt back up. So this is dafka din d'Rabbanan in the salt pool, because it looks like M'amer. And I both say, now watch this. Look at the second, Sif Lamed Vav in source 4, L'Ma'amer, Ulekach Aser D'Rabbanan, Aval Imor Gufa Leka, De'ein imur el begidulei karka. Okay, so again, Mishnah Berurah just wants to point out this is D'Rabbanan. This is D'Rabbanan. Right? Halacha, I said Da'araisa only applies to mamish items which grow from the ground, but D'Rabbanan, things which have the appearance almost as if they're coming from the ground are subject to M'amer as well. Okay, beautiful. Another example of Din D'Rabbanan. Take a look at number 5. Nispazru lo perus b'chaser. Shabbos say, watch this case. I'm holding a basket of apples, right? Right, I'm holding a basket of apples. Or for that matter, again, the apples, wouldn't be good if the apples fall off the tree because they're muktzah. I'm holding a basket of apples. I drop the basket. The fruit scatters everywhere. So Shabbos say, just right off the bat, is that M'amer? No. I want to collect it again. So let's assume let's say I dropped it in the chutzner, not in my house, I'm sorry. I dropped it in the chutzner where the apples grew. Right? Sorry. It's not growing from the ground, but it's growing from the tree, which is from the ground. Still called Gidulei Karka. So again,
you're never going to think an apple grew from the ground.
Why would, no, remember, growing from the ground, trees grow from the ground. See, even items that grow from the tree are called still subject to the same halachas, right? Even though it's not.
But these apples didn't grow here.
Let's say they did grow here. Again, it's my apple tree, my yard. I harvested it before Shabbos. Allah's gift. I'm walking with the basket. I trip. The fruit scatters. What would you say? Right. So good. Excellent. So good. So the first thing we have to think about maybe is, do we say yesh imor achar imor? So that could be a shayla. Ultimately, again, is there M'amer after M'amer? Now let's say, but the pashut answer, right? The pashut answer, midaraisa, is no. Right? At the end of the day, there's no M'amer over here, right? Because Lamaisa, again, they're already gathered up, not a problem. So listen to this case. Nispazlo peres b'chatzar, right? Or I will say, if you want to even make it more complicated, or easier, depending on how you want to view it. Again, as some of you mentioned, let's say these are apples I bought in the supermarket, right? They didn't grow here, right? So there's no pashos, there's no even imor achar imor in that kind of case. So now I came back with my basket from the supermarket. I tripped. They spread all over the place over the chutzner. So the Shulchan Aruch says echad heina v'echad heina, and literally they're dispersed. Melaket ma'at va'ochel. We'll say, what can you do? Let's translate first. He says, what can you do? You could gather it a little bit at a time, eating it while you're gathering it. So in other words, pretty much what you could do is, you could take what you need to eat. However, what can't you do? He says, V'lo yitain l'soch hasal, v'lo l'soch hakupa. Here's what you can't do. You can't take the basket and walk around the yard and start gathering back all of the apples. That you can't do. He says, obviously, we'll say, if like I tripped, the basket fell, but like all the apples stayed together, then that's not a problem to just put them back in the basket. But if I trip, they disperse, I can't start going around picking them up one by one to put in the basket. What I can do is, I could essentially pick up whatever you need to eat, and essentially pick it up as you use it. He says, Ella imke naflu, so fine, so let's leave that. So we'll say, what's the problem over here? So what exactly is the issue if I trip and my basket falls and the apples spread out? So it's not, so in other words, it could be M'amer D'Rabbanan, kind of just like the salt type of case. Certainly it looks like M'amer. Look at the Mishnah Berurah says in number 6. He says, D'zehavi ki'uvda d'chol. We'll say the problem with this is it resembles weekday activity. Kishemekamtzon v'noston l'soch hasal. So we'll say, the act of, see, this is interesting, but Mishnah Berurah brings down over something fascinating. The act of gathering dispersed produce, even if it's not ma'amer, it's still going to be asr. You know why? It looks like weekday activity. Looks like weekday activity. Uvda dechol. Masha'enken kishenaflu b'makom echad. Ach kishemalaktem isok sra safai. So we'll say, so ultimately again, halacha l'maisa, Mishnah Berurah says the problem over here is uvda dechol. Weekday activity. So it could also be the or tircha yisrael. Though tircha yisrael again, we'll have to distinguish between those two. But right now we'll just stick with uvda dechol. It's a weekday activity. Now, interestingly enough, when the Gemara Masechah Shabbos discusses uvda dechol, it actually, this is the paradigmatic case. Take a look at number 7. Gemara Masechah Shabbos, Tana Rabbanon, Nispazlu peros b'chatzer, right? I'm walking, and my basket falls out of my hand, and the fruit scatters everywhere. So melakate al yad v'ocha. So we'll say that lashon of al yad means you can pick it up one by one. But again, essentially, you could pick up what you're going to eat. You could pick up what you're going to use. Avalo b'sochach sal, v'lo b'sochach kipa. But you can't gather it into a basket. Because you shouldn't engage in activity that looks like weekday activity. So I will say, this was very exciting for me. Why? Because I will say, uvda dechol, right? So again, how do we say that in the vernacular? Uvda dechol? It's not Shabbos day. So we'll say, so not Shabbos day is like that term that you use when something doesn't feel right. We have absolutely no idea whether it's actually asr or mutter, right? It's what we try to use it in the chinuch of our kids. They see right through it, right? It's not Shabbos day. Really, I said this is not Shabbos day, but this is Shabbos day, right? So I was very excited when I saw this because I want to use this as a springboard, actually, for the remainder of our shiur, to speak out a definition of uvda dechol. Because it is interesting, and this is not a tangent. I'll tell you why it's not a tangent. Because interestingly enough, the paradigmatic example that the Gemara brings of uvda dechol, of weekday activity, is in this case of ma'amer. Well, it's not really ma'amer, but in the ma'amer family. Shabbos say, what is uvda dechol? In other words, what falls into this category? What is the definition, ultimately, again, of weekday activity uvda dechol? So we'll say, I want to show it something interesting. Take a look at the source number 8. This is from the Sefer. This is in the, in the Rabbi Ribiat 39 Melachos book. So in the back, he has, it's actually interesting, he has fascinatingly extensive footnotes. The footnotes are so extensive that they actually have it's called the Migdal David, and it's not a typo. It spells it with a yud. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's dedicated after someone. In any event, so he has an extensive discussion of this, and look what he writes. Source number 8. V'hinei. This was so affirming. V'hinei ikar hagidarim be'uvdun dechol lo nisba'aru be'gemara v'rishonim. This is incredible. The concept of uvda dechol, is really not explained. It's not explained. Weekday activity. Both sides, I want to be clear. Uvda dechol isn't, of course, it's not one of the 39 melachos, right? It's a rabbinic category. So he writes over here that the parameters of uvda dechol are not really spelled out in the Gemara. Both sides, remember, how many Gemaras are there about uvda dechol? 1. And you just saw it in number 7. That's it. That's the Gemara, uvda dechol. You're walking with a basket of fruit, you trip, the fruit spreads out, you can't gather all the fruit at once or put it into a basket. Why? Because that's the way you would do things during the week. Okay, so look what he writes. Ukimat, this is incredible. Ukimat, look at the verbiage here. Lo matzano yadayim v'raglayim lahavin ha'inyan al barav. This is wild. Let's say, what does that mean? Literally, we have no idea what this is. Right? We know that Chazal made this category, but Chazal did not define it. They just left it so incredibly ambiguous and amorphous. V'ayin kalkalas Shabbos, klali lamites malachos, klali lamites malachos, zivay mascha amnam, uvdun dechol v'zel shono. Yesh mashakasa, we'll say, skip down a little bit. Actually, it's quoted. Yesh mashakasa b'yigaris harambam, quote, skip, de'ena perush lesser kol masha osa b'chol. So we'll say, it can't be that uvda dechol. Let's be clear. It can't be that it means that you can't do on Shabbos anything you do during the week. Right? That can't be the definition. Why can't that be the definition? He says, De'im kain lo yochal v'lo yasuv kedar sha'osa b'chol. Let's say because there's a ton of activities that we do during the week that we also do during Shabbos, right? So in other words, it can't be that uvdin dechol means anything you do during the week you don't do on Shabbos. That's clearly not true. Ella, both say this is fascinating. So the Rambam is really the first to give us three categories. The Ella yesh bo gimel ofana. Both say here it is. Last three lines in number 8. There are three potential categories or frameworks for uvda dechol. Number 1, dahainu. Dahainu im sha'asru chachamim hadavar mishum didunya li'echad me'alamates melachos. So we'll say possibility 1 is Chazal answered something because it looks like one of the melachos. That's the first definition. Like in our case, right? That's the first definition of uvda dechol. Chazal said, you know what? Even though this action is not a melacha, it really looks a lot like a melacha. Says, I'm sorry? It looks as if. All right, Bexy, right, correct. Right? So ultimately, again, it looks like a malacha, and therefore, ultimately, again, we're going to avoid it. That's number 1. That's possibility 1. O mishum shema ayidei kach yavo lasos malacha. Possibility 2 is that maybe the action itself doesn't look like a malacha, but maybe what Chazal were afraid that if we let you do it, what will happen? You may come to perform a malacha. Okay? And possibility number 3, omishum tircha yiseirasa. Which we were saying before. Maybe the third possibility is because it's something that really has excessive exertion. Thank you. Excessive exertion. And therefore excessive exertion, by definition, is not something that Chazal wanted you to do on Shabbos. So we'll say, by the way, like the paradigmatic example of this is like a good tircha yiseir case of Shabbos. Moving furniture. Right? You decide, right, you're at the Shabbos table, you decide, the dining room would look so much better if the break front was over here, and the kid, right, by the way, those ideas never come from you, right? Those ideas often are offered by someone else, right? You are asked to execute. You're asked to execute, right? So I think it would look great. So technically speaking, is there a prohibition to move furniture on Shabbos? Well, there could be, right? Where could there be? Right? I'm sorry? You have to lift it up, right? But also remember again, this kotzer, there could be, not kotzer, choresh, right? Choresh. So okay, but assuming in my house, so lemaisa, again, technically speaking, no malacha, but again, perfect case of tircha yisera. So therefore, again, I will say, could very well be that category number 3, or possibility number 3 is, what falls into uvdin dechol? Anything that has tircha yisera. So I'll say, so therefore again, the Rambam essentially gives 3, and they're not mutually exclusive, by the way. They can all be true. Essentially 3 different streams of uvdin dechol. Either an action that is not a malacha, but it resembles a malacha, an action that is not a malacha, but may lead you to do a malacha, or a malacha that requires, or an action that is not a malacha, but requires excessive exertion. Okay, so I'll say, so now, if we plug this into our case, now our Uvda dechol is a Shabbos, which means it's Tirabanan. The challenge we have is knowing what to put into that category. And the problem is Chazal, unlike other malachos, where you could see, again, Chazal built out an entire rabbinic construct, we don't have it by Uvdin dechol. So we're going to find, like a lot of these things, that's why, so it falls under the category of Shavuos, which means it's in a Tirabanan. So therefore, again, yes.
This is probably a stupid question, but why couldn't you solve the problem of what it looks like by doing a shinoi?
Shinoi downgrades severity. It doesn't take it away. So you only use a shinoi when you have to do something and you want to minimize the prohibition involved, so you go ahead and use a shinoi. But shinoi is not like fairy dust. You know what I'm saying? It's not like shinoi.
When you walk, right, and you carry something, you can only take a few steps and stop and go do that. I mean,
no, you can't do that.
You can't?
You cannot. But if you are stuck and there is no other way to navigate the situation, you could rely on that. In other words, you can't proactively rely on that on Shabbos.
No, but if you want to bring a bottle of wine to somebody and you're walking to their house and you go, I should have done it before Shabbos, and you were carrying something, or carrying anything, not wine, anything. So,
first of all, unless it's coming to me and it's a really good bottle, right? Then you put it down. You can, in other words, if you realize that you're carrying that bottle of wine and there's no eruv, and you're like, all right, whatever, I've got it already, in other words, you put that down and you leave it. and you do not take it. If it's something more significant or something that you can't put down, that's a different discussion. But you would not rely on that. First of all, it happens to Matt. It's an excellent question. It's not a simple question. It's actually an excellent question, and we're actually going to talk about that. But this, I think, is one of the widely misunderstood concepts about shinui. Right? Shinui doesn't make something permitted. Shinui just lessens the transgression involved. So when you're stuck, you want to minimize, because I may have to do it anyway, but you cannot rely on that.
When you say lessons, does that mean you're still doing an Avera?
Yep.
Really?
Yeah. You want to see me after this year? We could talk it out a little bit. Yeah. We could talk about it. There are options. I'm sorry? I do whatever. I have a little booth. With some lattice set up. Yes.
I'll ask a little bit of a controversial question. Does each generation have the authority, the rabbis in each generation have the authority to say this is illegal?
Yeah. So that is a very good question. So it seems to be that the stream of thought in the poskim is whatever the Shulchan Aruch brings down as Uvdin Dechol, that's Uvdin Dechol. And we do not add on anything to the technical construct. In other words, do I think that it's good in a home for a family to say, you know what, okay, this is mutter, but it's not in the spirit of Shabbos for us. Do I think that's good, like on a family by family, on a chinuch level? Sure. But from a halachic construct, the potency seems to say, we're going to see, by the way, there are examples. Well, remember, ball playing, we saw ball playing could really have muktzah, and remember again, you also have a potential choresh issue, thank you, choresh issue. So, right, but I'm saying, ball playing could really actually involve like significant Isurei D'Oraisa. So that's I wouldn't use that as an example, right? Maybe if you live in a city that's totally paved, there's not one piece of grass, then maybe ball playing is relegated to like a different level. But if you live in grassy areas, ball playing is. I think there's also a common element to say people think that ball playing is an issue of like it's not Shabbos day. No, you really may be quite literally treading upon Isurei D'Oraisa. I'm sorry. So riding a bike is a potential issue of makeh b'patish, or a potential issue of bonus shemi yitaking. So again, Chavra, we're gonna let's good. This is exciting again, but we'll see. So the simple answer is we're gonna go through some examples right now. What did we do riding a bike? It's smichas chaver. All right, we'll come back to that. All right, well, so now, kind of plugging this back. So now I understand the Shulchan Aruch. So Shulchan Aruch says I carry a basket of apples. I trip, the basket of apples, spreads out everywhere. So what's the halacha? I can gather them one by one to go ahead and consume it. What can't I do? I can't go ahead and gather them all up together in my basket. Why? Uvda dechol. And I will say, if you think about it again, number one, it looks like a malacha, right? This is actually an interesting case. It looks like a malacha. Number two, it may lead you to do a malacha. And number three, it's tirchei yisera. So it's just interesting to note that this, which makes sense, this is the paradigmatic case. This case is what kind of gives birth, births these three different streams of thought in Uvda Dechol. Okay, so once we're on it, I got very excited about this because I have to say it was very validating. I always felt like there's something fundamental missing in my knowledge base, which there is, but to me, Uvda Dechol, I never really was able to put it together. What is, I know example, so it's very validating to see this footnote to essentially says, we don't really know. We can't find our hands or our feet in this. Chazal gave us such little information, yet we know that it is a category that exists. Well, so let me show you some other examples. Take a look at number 11. These are totally unrelated, but they're interesting. Also, ligragvina b'Shabbos b'moreg. Oh, sorry, I skipped. Number 9. Mutter lach toch basar mavushal tzli dak b'sakis. We're going to get to this. One of the interesting melachos we're going to have is tochen. Tochen means grinding. means grinding. So now what is quite little? Where is grinding done? You take wheat, or for that matter, some herbs, and you go and you grind it in. You grind them up to either to make the dye or to make again the flour for the lechem upon him. Shabbos say along the malach of tchina. So the Shulchan Aruch says what, but you are allowed to, let's say, take a piece of meat and chop it up finely. Now, we're going to see, by the way, the Shulchan Aruch chooses meat because, let's say, there's actually, again, coming attractions, making, let's say, an Israeli salad, finely diced Israeli salad on Shabbos could be a true halachic problem because tochin applies to items that grow from the ground and it means cutting them up very finely. It doesn't apply, let's say, to meat, right? Because meat is not gedulei karka. So you want to take a piece of meat, you want to cut it up, you want to make like a pulled beef, you want to go ahead and cut it very, very finely. You're allowed to do that on Shabbos. That's not a problem. Misakin. So the Mishnah. So take a look at number 10. Mishnah Berurah says, "Asher lachtoch de'ein tchina el lo begedulei karka." Very simple, because the malach of tochin of grinding only applies to items that grow from the ground, and meat doesn't grow from the ground. So both saying. Now watch this. Based on this, if I were to ask you, right, you're having cheese on Shabbos, right now. If you're having cheese on Shabbos, you need to, after Matt finishes with me after the shir, right? You need to come with me also, right? Again, no excuse for that, even on a long Shabbos, unexcusable, right? Milchik says no place on Shabbos, at most Malava Malka, at most, and even then, begrudgingly. I would say, so let me say now, so based on what we just learned, if you're having cheese and you want to use a cheese grater on Shabbos, can you use it? What would you say? Bepashtos. Yes. Why? Why? Because again, remember, what am I doing? I'm grinding something up, but it's cheese. Right? So cheese ultimately, again, right, be careful with your finger. Yeah, this is don't do it blindfolded. You should look.
I don't do it.
I'm sure that's the only reason you don't do it. So Lemaisa, Bepashtos, using a cheese grater should be absolutely fine as well. Because remember again, the only issue involved will be tochein. But Lemaisa again, there's no techina, there's no grinding by non-gidulei karka. So interestingly enough, take a look at number 11. The Shulchan Aruch Paskins, Aser ligra hagvina b'Shabbos b'moreg charetz ba'fifios shekor. Okay, you can't use a cheese grater on Shabbos. Why can't you use a cheese grater on Shabbos? Mishnah Berurah says in number 12, Dechevan shakli miyuchad lakach harezed derechol. So this is fascinating, right? This is fascinating. So Mishnah Berurah says, no, you can't. Why? Because it's uvda dechol. It's uvda dechol, right? This is he says, vidami, now this is interesting, vidami, l'shchikas tavlin b'machtashas. Shabbos say, see, here's what's fascinating. Remember, uvda dechol has to do one of three things. Either it has to go ahead and look like a malacha, it has to go ahead and potentially lead you to a malacha, or involve tircha yisera. Tircha Yisera doesn't really seem to apply over here, right? So really, what are we worried about? So the Mishnah Berurah says it looks like the grinding up for spice, for spices. For spices. So that could be slikas samamonim. So again, grinding up of spices. And grinding up of spices ultimately, again, is malach of tochein. So using a grater, using a kli, essentially, it's a distinction between using a knife. In other words, you could take the same block of cheese and cut it up into very small, thin shreds, right? But yet you can't use the grater to do the same thing.
It's counterintuitive because it's more tircha.
It's more tircha, right? It's more work. It's interesting. It's more work to do with the knife than it is to do with the grater. But since the grater is a kli hamayucha lakach, it's a type of ours. It's a utensil that is. So therefore, again, uvda dechol. Again, I'm just giving you examples. Take a look at number 13.
What about like the peeler, the cheese?
So again,
It's a slicer.
a slicer is fine because that's like a knife. That's like a knife. Yeah, this is about the shredding of it. Remember, that's why he says it's domun l'schikas tavlin. It has the appearance ultimately. Yeah, I don't know. It's okay, whatever. Assuming that it operates like a knife, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. Post it. Look at number 13. Another example of this. Again, I just want to show you, like, to a certain degree. It's not that the malachos of uvda, or that, I should say malachos, not the concept of uvda is random, but it feels a little random. Like, in other words, we have the cases that the halacha brings down, and they're just interesting. Now, once you say it, it makes sense. Like, in other words, okay, I got it. I shouldn't use a cheese grater. And by the way, it's not just the cheese grater. You have to, obviously the same thing would apply ultimately, again, to a potato grater. But a potato grater is a much bigger issue because remember again, potatoes are gidulei karka. So potatoes are actually subject to tochein. Okay, so we'll say, let's take a look at number 13. This is just another interesting application of uvda dechal. Again, I just thought these cases are fascinating. He writes, Amar Huna, Hai tabcha delosar sakina kamei chacham shmisham tinalei. Both sides. The Gemara Masechus Chulin says, shochet has to show his shchita knife, his chalaf, has to show his shchita knife to the Talmud Chacham in the city. Right? As a shochet, you have to present your knife before the Talmud Chacham of the city for inspection. And if you're a shochet and you don't do that, you know what happens? Cherem, excommunication. I mean, shamta. Rava Amar ma'arino le. Rava says we remove him from his position as a shochet. Umachrazinan abisra de trefehi. Wow. Right? Shabbos say, so it's pretty intense. So Rava says, halacha l'mhaisa, forget about excommunicating him. He loses his job, and ultimately we declare that any meat that he shechted is a treifa. Okay, now what's going on over here? Excuse me. Take a look at number 15. Rashi says, why do we excommunicate him? Right? So I understand that we want the Talmud Chacham Arba say, the halachos of Shechita. Remember again from our Daf Yomi days in the last segment of Masechus Chulin. So there are many different things that could passel a Shechita, and one of the things that of course could derail everything is the smallest nick in the knife. So I understand the need to go ahead and want to present it and have someone else inspect it, but the notion that you're going to put someone in cherem and potentially make them lose their livelihood and declare everything they shechted a treifa, it sounds pretty intense. What's the pshat? So Rashi says over here, number 15, skip to 15, Rashi says, Misham tinale mishum af kirusa shehichtzif panav kidekaimelon. So we'll say, so listen to this, shehichtzif panav, what's hichtzif panav? I'm a chutzaf. It's chutzpah. It's a lack of derech eretz. You're supposed to show your knife to the Rav of the city, Talmud Chacham of the city, and you did not do so. That's chutzpah. And therefore, again, kedekay malon, menadin al kavod harav. So we'll say it is considered to be such an affront, and such a slight to the Rav of the city that ultimately, again, we excommunicate such a person. We'll say, it's just interesting that sometimes we think that like chutzpah is just a bad midah, right? It's not just that chutzpah is a bad midah. We'll say chutzpah is the worst midah. It's the worst midah. Again, for those of us, Baruch Hashem, who have children and trying to raise our children, I'll say, I'm always a big believer, you should really give your kids a pass on most things they do wrong. Because the truth is, they don't really rise to the level. The one thing that it is so important for a parent to have zero tolerance on is chutzpah. Because chutzpah, even the smallest amount of it, ultimately, again, so easily amplifies and grows into such negativity. Chutzpah to a parent, chutzpah to a sibling, chutzpah, zero tolerance. Zero tolerance. My children know whatever grade they get, as long as they try. But like chutzpah, so they make sure not to be chutzpahdik when I'm not looking. And that's but Lamaisa will say, so it's just interesting to see. It's just interesting to see how you see over here that like, what did the shochet do? He wasn't mechutzaf. He was mechutzaf, a chutzpah. You're supposed to show your knife to the Rav of the city. You didn't do so. Okay, we excommunicate you. Take a look at number 16. And I was thinking, what does this have to do with M'amer? So it has nothing to do with M'amer. It doesn't have to do with Uvda D'chal. I just got so excited to find the opportunity to speak on Uvda D'chal. So I'll say, take a look at number 16. Tabach. Shelo hera sakina l'chacham v'nim seis yafa hayeminadin osa. So we'll say, listen how Shalom codifies the halacha. If you have a tabach, is a butcher, a shochet, who did not show his knife to the Rav of the city. Now I will say, what's the good news? It was found, the knife was fine. V'nim seis yafa minadin osa. We'll say, even if your knife is totally fine, the shechita was totally good, still going to excommunicate you because it's a chutzpah. Haga v'nim paguma minadin osa mavir osa. Okay, v'nim seis yafa. Okay, fine. So we'll say, skip to the third line. Says the Rama, V'ha'idna. Now watch this. The Rama says, but everything is different now. How is it different now? Nagu limnos anoshim yidun ala shchita v'abedika. So we'll say, this is fascinating. From the Rama's statement, you begin to see that really, during times of the Gemara, it's almost as if like shchita was an unregulated industry. So what do you do in an unregulated industry? So obviously, if you know the person, you trust him. So one of the ways in which they kind of ensured quality assurance by shechita is you had to bring your knife to the Rav. Right? You would show it to him. Now, B'Pashtos, when you're bringing your knife to the Rav, what is the Rav going to do? What is he going to do? So tell me a little bit about, what method do you use for shchita? How do you do with hagrama? How do you do with alcohol? So he's going to feel out the guy a little bit. And Amos says, now, shchita is a regulated industry. In other words, not every butcher. So that's why it's interesting. But if you notice also, the Gemara doesn't call the shochet a shochet. What does it call him? A butcher. Because which is interesting, right? Because today's day and age, a shochet and a butcher are two different people, right? The shochet is the ritual slaughterer. The butcher is the guy who's carving up the meat. So it's interesting from the Gemara's perspective. It was one-stop shop, right? In other words, everybody was doing the orders. If you're the butcher, that means you know how to do shchita. So that's why you have to regulate everything more. So the Amos says now, va'idna nagu limnos anoshim yidum ala shchita v'abdika. So now, both says, now we have appointed people, shochtim. People who are appointed over shchita and bedika, people who inspect the animal after shchita as well. V'lahem machlu chachamam kivodam kihem zihirim uzerizim. So both say, and now what's interesting is as follows. The Rav of the city or of the town, there's a mechila. There's a mechila. The Rav says, it's fine, you don't have to bring me your knife. He doesn't even have to say it. It's kind of like a built-in mechila. Since we assume that today the people doing shchita are trained, it is now a regulated industry. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, you don't have to come to the Talmud Chacham. He says, fine. So now here's what's interesting. Take a look. So that's the halacha. That's halacha bosei. Now, watch this. Take a look at number 17. Rashi Mesechus Be'er. It's getting exciting. Look what he writes. He says, now remember, you're allowed to shecht on Yom Tiv, right? Ochel nefesh. So, do you have to bring your knife to the Chacham on Yom Tiv? She'etilu Chacham al tabach me'ar sakin l'Chacham, kodem shishchushu mehema, u'ma lasos kein b'Yom Tiv. Do you need to bring the knife to the Talmud Chacham on Yom Tiv? Mi mechsi k'uvda d'chol, da'av shamil so shadaita limkar ba'atlis, olo mechsi. Shabbos said, listen to how fascinating this is. Just so you see how uvda d'chol is like not thrown around, but is applied in so many different ways. Shabbos said, what are we concerned about? We're concerned that if you bring the knife to the Talmud Chacham on Yom Tiv, it looks like uvda d'chol. Now, Shabbos said, why does that look like uvda d'chol? Right? So you can't tell me that what? You can't tell me that it looks like a malacha. Why? It's not a malacha. It's not going to lead to a malacha because it's not a malacha. Right? What's the last piece? Tircha yisera? None of that. So Rashi said like this, what are we concerned about? Remember, Abosai, most shchita that's done is done for what purpose? It's done for what purpose? Commerce purposes. So the question just is, does it have the appearance, when you bring your shchita knife to the Talmud Chacham on Yom Tiv, does it have the appearance that you are engaging in commercial activity? That's the uvda d'chol. Now, I'll just quote to you number 18, just because of time, I'll just do it outside. In number 18, the Rambam says, that's not the uvda d'chol. The uvda d'chol that we're concerned about is, maybe the Talmud Chacham is going to tell you that ultimately, again, the knife is not good. And what are you going to do? You're going to sharpen it. Now, sharpening the knife, ultimately, again, is makib patish. That's a malacha. That's malacha, right? That's significant stuff. So it's interesting over here. So both Rashi and the Rambam are both intrigued by this idea about is showing the knife to the Talmud Chacham on Yom Tov uvda d'chol. Rashi says the uvda d'chol is, it looks like maybe it's for commercial purposes. The Rambam uvda d'chol, you may actually come to do a malacha. How do we paskin? Just interesting. How do we paskin? The Shulchan Aruch number 19. Ein marin sakin l'chacham b'Yom Tov. Liros imroi lishchot bo, shematia peguma, v'yomer lo asra lishchot ba mimnei pegimusa, v'yelech v'yechad b'mashchezes. So what's that Shulchan Aruch paskins? Halach l'mais, so we don't show a knife to a Talmud Chacham ultimately again on Yom Tov. Now, so what are you supposed to do? Just to show him the knife before Yom Tov. In other words, the goal is to go into Yom Tov with a checked knife. Now again, halacha l'maisa. Look what he writes over here. Skip down a little bit. He says, "Va'achshav bizman hazeh shekol shochet roa sakin basmo." Now remember, 19 links back with number 16. But now that halacha l'maisa, every shochet, right? We don't really take the knife to the Rav anymore. Every shochet checks his own knife. Kol harotza lishchot b'Yom Tov yivdok sakino me'erev Yom Tov. V'lo b'Yom Tov shemen yashchizena mirum labatko me'erev Yom Tov v'shasat chach yachal labatko b'Yom Tov. So we'll say, now watch this. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, check your knife before Yom Tov. Everybody check, every shochet check their own knife. What happens if the shochet did not check his knife, right? And let's say, again, there's no other checked knife in the city, then what? Halacha l'maisa, you could check it on Yom Tov itself. Tzir says, here's what's interesting. Remember, since the whole issue with checking a knife on Yom Tov is what? Is uvda d'chol, right? Because either it looks like commerce, or you may actually come to go at. So therefore, again, if there's another competing, compelling need that offsets the uvda d'chol, ultimately, again, it becomes permitted. So I will say, so now again, first of all, mazel tov on finishing M'amer. Shkoyach, this is the end of Malach. I know it's sad to go, it's sad to leave M'amer behind, but we're on to bigger and better things in Mirat Hashem. So we're going to finish that with M'amer, and I will say, isn't it exciting? We also, by the way, learned the entire sugya of Uvda D'chol. By the way, that's it. I'm not holding anything back. That is the entirety of Uvda D'chol, but at least, again, I think what we emerge with is that three-pronged understanding from the Rambam. I will say, also just one last thing. I think what we're going to do, I just called a little bit of a, what is it? Audible. I called it audible. Which is that the first, there's no shir this coming Monday. No shir is coming Monday night. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make the first bechina on the first three Melachos of Choresh, Kotzer, or Choresh, Zoreya, and Kotzer. So it's going to cover the first three Melachos. I'm going to get it to Emirat Hashem by tomorrow. I just have to add in the Kotzer piece. So it'll be on that. And in Emirat Hashem, you'll have the rest of this week and Emirat Hashem next week, if you want to do that, I mean, whatever. If you don't feel that you can, fine, it's all right, whatever, it's fine. Right, but the mice again, it's a thorough, but nothing tricky about it. Short answers, everything short answer. My only request is, please don't write, just type. Partial phrases are fine. It's just mamish. It's supposed to be a chazara, and then Emirat Hashem. The next bechin will pick up from M'amer and on. All right, they will say shkoyach.
Hearing you share an umbrella.